Hello, everyone. I'm John Coleman from ApocatastasisInstitute for the Humanities, an alternative college and high school here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. The purpose of this broadcast is to get into week 3 of 13 in this fall semester, making our way through the project. Not the projects, the project, which is Apocatastasis Unified Humanities Curricula. And this encompasses over a 3-year cycle, all of human history. And then we start again. And there are 3 banks of readings, that is to say, 3 readings selected for each day of the year, each season being 13 weeks. And we are this year, because it is a new work in progress, we are chiefly making our way through H.G. Wells's Outline of History. That forms the first cycle of readings. The second cycle is an appropriate article. And then the third cycle is an appropriate piece of literature. And in these weekly broadcasts, I like to touch on the main points of the appointed selections. Now, if this project of learning human history in a synchronized fashion, principally using history and literature, but also philosophy and art besides literature, physical types of art and so forth, if this interests you, you are welcome and invited to enroll for a more serious study of this self-same material. And we have various ways that you can do that depending on your interest and what you're able to commit to time-wise and financially. And we have a monthly option where we meet once a month for a couple hours and go over the main points and set you up for the next month of study. We also have weekly options. And these first 2 are especially appropriate for adult learners. And then we do, if you really get inspired and fired for this material, today happens to be the old memorial of the Stigmata of St. Francis, and that's one of the words that's in the collect for today. In a world growing cold, Francis was on fire. Well, are we on fire for the humanities? Well, hopefully this series will do the trick. And if you really get on fire for such a study, I encourage you to consider enrolling full-time, where we meet 4 times each week and really dig deep into this material that's in the project volumes, which you can download freely from our site in the description. But also a lot more. All of the tiers have a discussion element to them, a lecture element, as well as tests, quizzes, writing assignments. So different ways to get deeper into the material. Right now, for various technological reasons, schools are having to justify their existence. And one of the things that cannot be emphasized enough about why schools ought to exist in society is that they scaffold knowledge. They portray and present knowledge in a unified setting. And that's frankly been an area where modern pedagogy, public, private, and home, religious and secular, has really dropped the ball for the last 150 years. But it's better than nothing in the sense that it's better than the total chaos of internet land, where it's nearly endless data, but absolutely no unified system to organize it. Even the Rockefeller schools, and please God, we've improved much in this area of unifying the knowledge. But even the Rockefeller modern schools, public, private, and home, religious and secular, will offer some coordination to data, which is something we're losing, and we don't quite realize that we need it. And Anyway, that's a big discussion, and it's simply enough to say that here with this project presentation, we do have this synchronized teaching. And so without further ado, let's get into a few odds and ends, and we have our advertisement coming up, and then we'll get right into our poem for the week and into our points proper to this. So here we'll get the screen share going. And there we go. All right, so the opening image was a type of digital image of hunter-gatherers in the act of hunting and gathering. And that's pretty much where we're at in our HGUL study, as well as our coordinated secondary article, which we'll introduce momentarily. And there is something genuinely artistic about digital imagery and so forth, and you can see it here. It does take a special skill. And now we get into the advertisement for today, and that is our Reaching Higher Parents Development Program. And so this is appropriate for homeschooling parents, but also all of you parents that want to, utilitarianly assist your child with their homework, but also to walk with your child in their studies. And, those of you who darken the door of a church, you ought to be familiar with the fact that you cannot just drop your child off for Sunday school or CCD or whatever you call your church classes for your kids. You know that you cannot drop your child off and pick them up and have no reinforcement of faith in the home and hope that that child will grow into a follower of Christ or whatever your religion is. Well, guess what? The same is true for a life of the mind. And this is where, again, we've completely dropped the ball. Even more so, I suppose. At least the religious sorts, they kind of get that there has to be a reinforcement, and actually more than a reinforcement. In fact, the Sunday school CCD stuff should only actually be reinforcing what the child's getting at home, not vice versa. Anyway, when it comes to things of the mind and developing that skill, that truly educated characteristic in your child, parents, you have to walk with your child in that. You cannot just send your child off to school and hope that you're going to get someone with a spirit of education, that spirit of inquiry and wonder and humility. And so with all of that being said, we have this Reaching Higher Parents Development Program where we can teach you the nuts and bolts of history or literature or mathematics, as we would in any of our courses, but also towards, here are some of the courses, also towards the I in how you can better help your child. So there's kind of a mashup of the actual science you wish to study, but also pedagogy as well. And we have all sorts of classes here. And if we don't have it, just ask, and we probably can arrange it for you with one of our staff members. And here's just one example of our Latin series for our parents program. So we teach you the nuts and bolts of Latin in this example, but also how you can better teach your child. Okay, so that's our Reaching Higher program. And now we get into our poem. And this is The Emperor of Ice Cream by Wallace Stevens. The heart of the project, what we read through every month, is a cursus of poetry. And you can download this, volume 1, that we're getting through. And it begins with the 250 odd poems we read each month, again and again and again. Whilst the humanities study takes 3 years, we're constantly hitting the poetry, because the poetry is the distillation of the human soul. And so this is from a Connecticut poet, or at least a poet we captured, much like Mark Twain. And it's called The Emperor of Ice Cream, and a yummy image here. Actually, this poem is not about ice cream at all. I'll tell you what it is after. Call the roller of big cigars, the muscular one, and bid him whip in kitchen cups concupiscent curds. Let the wenches dawdle in such dress, as they are used to wear, and let the boys bring flowers in last month's newspaper. Let be finale of seam, the only emperor is the emperor of ice cream. Take from the dresser of deal, lacking the 3 glass knobs, that sheet on which she embroidered fantails once, and spread it so as to cover her face. If her horny feet protrude, they come to show how cold she is and dumb. Let the lamp affix its beam, the only emperor is the emperor of ice cream. Thus is The Emperor of Ice Cream by Wallace Stevens. Stevens was a modernist poet, and actually, unfortunately, Substack did not split the 2 stanzas. And so it appears to be one column. It's actually very deliberately broken up into 2 scenes here. This actually takes place at a funeral. And if you want to get a little bit deeper into this, I have this audio-visual recording by this gentleman where he really unpacks the poem. There's a lot going on in The Emperor of Ice Cream. But anyhow, Stevens is a great poet. And with that, let's hop along, Cassidy. So again, the purpose here is simply to lay out some of the main themes. So overall, in week 3, we're looking at the origins of religion, and that also is the focus of the secondary article. So we have the origins of religion, and that theme is basically our overall theme for the second reading for the whole week. Now, Wells begins with the religious topic, but then he gets into skull shapes and his evolutionary look at things. And then towards the end of the week, he introduces the topic that we're going to be spending quite a bit of time with today, and that is Indo-Aryan languages. So we're going to be looking at religion's origins and Indo-Aryan languages. And we'll hop along here. So this is from the Outline of History. Again, all of this can be downloaded from the project site, linked below. Wells begins, a disposition to propitiate him after he was dead is quite understandable. Now, this picks up directly from the day before, logically enough. And so what Wells has laid out is a natural understanding to how religion could have developed. That does not preclude a supernatural understanding, much like evolution does not preclude creation. And he lays out this idea of the old man, that the father figure of the tribe or the hunter-gatherer clan was a somewhat, by necessity, had to be a fearsome person who could keep discipline, and that to a certain extent this influences the conceptions of God or gods in various parts of the world. That you have, in order to survive, you have the origins, and we can even see this, the origins of the state. You have to have a hard man, a strong man. A strong man, you need that to keep the hunter-gatherer tribes surviving. The ones that don't have a strong man are the ones that don't survive. And so you had to have this strong patriarchal figure, and that this personality, that this becomes so dominant, basically becomes the gods. Psychologically, the gods become a projection of this strong man that the hunter-gatherer groups and then early settlements and so forth needed in this land, as Hobbes said, where life is short and brutish and violent. A disposition to propitiate the old man after he was dead is quite understandable. One was not sure if he was actually dead. He might only be asleep he might only be a sheep or shamming. He might be putting it on. Long after an old man was dead, when there was nothing to represent him but a mound and a megalith, The woman would convey to their children how awful and wonderful the formal tribal leader had been. And being still a terror to his own tribe, it was easy to go on hoping that he would be a terror to other and hostile people. In his life, he had fought for his tribe, even if he had bullied it. Why not when he was dead? One sees that the old man idea was a very natural one to the primitive mind and capable of great development. Another idea probably arose out of this mysterious visitation of infections and diseases, and that was the idea of uncleanness and of being accursed, and the old spelling. From that, too, there may have come the idea of avoiding particular places and persons in particular phases of hell. Here was the root of another set of taboos, also the old spelling. So we see the origins on a natural level of gods and goddesses, eventually, and then also of taboos, which will enter into religious significance. Then man, from the very dawn of his mental life, may have had a feeling of a sinister feeling about places and things. Animals who dread traps have that feeling. A tiger will abandon its usual jungle route at the sight of a few threads of cotton. Like most young animals, young human beings are easily made fearful by this or that thing their nurses and seniors tell them. Here's another set of ideas of repulsion and avoidance that spring up almost inevitably in men. And again, none of this precludes the supernatural. We're just on, for this purpose, again, in reading 3, which is yet to be added, we have yet to get into the philosophical or religious, but there will be a counterweight. But yeah, there is obviously a connection between many taboos, for instance, and health. Food taboos and taboos around the dead and around sickness and around clean and unclean foods and menstrual periods and so forth. All of this has, a very convenient reflection onto health or unhealth and sickness and health. As soon as speech began to develop, it must have got to work upon such fundamental feelings and began to systematize them and to keep them in mind. By talking together, men would reinforce each other's fears and establish a common tradition of taboos and things forbidden and of things unclean. And when the idea of uncleanness would come, ideas of cleansing and removing a curse, and cleansing would be conducted through the advice or the aid of old wise men or old wise women. And in such cleansing would lie the germ of the earliest priestcraft and witchcraft. Now, tradition, again, also has a labor-saving aspect to it. Religious taboos and traditions and just tribal social taboos, etc. And enjoinders, things that one ought to do, and do it because the elders have done it. On what grounds? Well, very simply enough, the elders have survived. And if your ass wishes to survive, maybe you and I, and the young of the tribe ought to emulate them. So that's kind of the psychology we see there. The speech from the first would be a powerful supplement to merely imitative education and to the education of cuffs and blows conducted by a speechless parent. Mothers would tell their young and scold their young. As speech developed, men would find they had experiences and persuasions that seemed to give them power. They would make secrets of things. There is a double streak in the human mind, a streak of cutting secretiveness and a streak perhaps of later origin that makes us all anxious to tell and astonish and impress each other. Many people make secrets in order to have secrets to tell. These secrets of early men, they were conveyed to the younger, more impressionable people, more or less honestly and impressively in some process of initiation. Moreover, the pedagogic spirit overflowed in the human mind. Most people like telling other people not to. Extensive arbitrary prohibitions for the boys, for the girls, for the women also probably came very early into human history. Then the idea of the sinister has for its corrective the idea of the propitious. And from that, the idea of making things propitious by ceremonies is an easy step indeed. So you have an environment for the early man that is tremendously frightful and dangerous for them. Um, Regarding the animals, regarding sickness and disease, the weather. And religion allows one to scaffold, to use an earlier word in this presentation, to scaffold all of these experiences of mystery, yes, danger, but also right next to that mystery, and to scaffold them into making some sense of it. And especially when it's connected to observable phenomena, these taboos and customs and propitiations, often linked to health, often linked to the group's survival, and taboos indeed about other tribes and how you conduct yourselves in terms of marriage and warfare and trade and raiding and raping, how you conduct yourself in regards to other hunter-gatherer tribes and early settlements. All of this kind of becomes a shorthand. I mean, religion becomes a shorthand. Now, I don't know, we're not quite at the religious stage here. We're at a more primitive stage, which you can only vaguely call religious, where we're at, taboos and superstitions and magic. Eventually, this will refine itself some more, but we'll get to that down the line, principally during the so-called axial age. But right now, you are seeing, the beginnings of this, the embryo of religion proper. And again, to read that the idea of the sinister has for its corrected the idea of the propitious. And from that idea to making things propitious by ceremonies is a very easy step. A lot of more anachronistic writing here, which is why I just tripped up there. It's an easy step. Easy step, we might say now. Although that does sound a little bit stilted. An historian. A historian. Okay. Now, I mean, one example, you talk about the danger of things, and we talked about the flooding of the Mediterranean Valley last week with climate change and the rising of the Atlantic. You have the flooding of the valley, and we looked at that. I mean, think about talk about a traumatic event. Think about it more importantly, to use your imagination and mind, that you have just water cascading. What did they say? Like 30 Niagara Falls, where what we call Tunisia and Sicily, that area, because there's a drop and it gets much deeper. If you were going from the west to the Mediterranean, there's this kind of shelf, and it's deep enough. It's a sea, after all, yes. But then it really drops off, and there you had, this huge volume of water. Well, imagine living there and watching over years, the water level here rise, and you have to skedaddle out of the way. I mean, that's a very dramatic example. To add to all of this, slings and arrows, quite literally, of hunter-gatherer life. Okay, so now I'd like to move on to reading 2. Now, what I read was just a part of Sunday's introduction, and he follows that theme out, moving, as I say, into skull shapes and interbreeding of the different strains or I hate to say species of mankind, and then moving finally by the end of the week into next week's major theme, as we're going to look at today, of the Indo-Aryan theory. Now, anyhow, continuing with the religious theme, our second reading for this week is completely from the beginning. Sunday is from the beginning, and the rest of the week continues. Religion, Its Origin, Social Role, and Sources of Variation by Richard Startup from the Open Journal of Philosophy. So we're just going to continue this because, religion is such a focus of mankind from start to finish, because it does put life, into a certain intelligible mode. So the aim of this article is to illuminate the multifaceted phenomena of religion using a wide range of evidence and argument. Consideration is given to the origins of religion, its social role, and some key sources of variation. And anthropological studies amply illustrate religion and magic tend to permeate social life in pre-literate societies. Off the cuff, how would we differentiate religion and magic? I would say religion has some moral aspect to it, in the sense that it connects divine interactions with one's behavior on the earth, whereas magic is by definition, it's ceremonies and words that are themselves supposed to have some energy to them, regardless of behavior, right? There's not a logical connection. The magical worldview, which is very much going to dominate from the sources that we have, a lot of human life up until maybe 5,000, 4,000 years ago, the magical worldview, which will give way to the religious worldview, there's a lack of logic. Whereas in religion, you're going to often see that there will be some connection to behavior, often what we call morality, and the propitiation or the annoyance of the gods or God, or the powers that be. And I don't mean that in terms of political powers, but the elemental powers. Whereas magic doesn't have that logical connection. Religion has a logical connection of results to some behavior that's often connected to higher levels of thinking, like morality or religious ceremonies or so forth, whereas magic is by definition removed from logic. Magic is limited in its scope, whilst religion possesses by the way, those are my parsings, and now we're going to get to the author's startup. He says magic is limited in its scope, whilst religion possesses various aspects or dimensions: the practical and ritual, the experiential and the emotional, the narrative or mythic, the ethical and legal, and the material. Despite there being an elaborate narrative or mythic dramatis personae, for instance, of gods and angels, the only factitities, which one comes up against, are people acting in religious ways for buildings, works of art, and other material creations. Let's find out what this word means. Couldn't be a journal article, open or otherwise, without fancy jargon. I'll go there. So much for the feature. All right, let's try it here. Facticity is the quality condition of being a fact. Facticity. Okay. So now it's made plural, facticities. Let's start that again, that whole sentence. If I can, there we go. Okay, so from the top, despite there being an elaborate narrative or mythic dramatis personae, for instance, gods and angels, the only facticities which one comes up against are people acting in religious ways or buildings, works of art, and other material creation. Religion is evidently strongly integrated and highly strategic in the social, including cooperative life of a society, through its role in regulating the widest range of behaviors. Right? So, in addition to my point that magic is removed from logic, whereas religion is making some connection between cause and effect. In addition, religion is more complicated because there's necessarily this much more social aspect to it than one sees in magic, and it affects the widest range of behaviors. A religion is built up cooperatively over many generations. Again, we want to, on a natural plane, see religion as a hack, a life hack of sorts, where with the propitiations and sins that are baked into these early, very early, I don't even know if we could properly call hunter-gatherer, religions in the more certainly not the refined senses, but you can start seeing, for instance, in the way that graves are aligned, um, and higher levels of thinking of an afterlife where tools and implements are being buried with people, and there's a direction, maybe towards the rising sun, or a different position all the bodies are put into. All of this, all of this indicates more complex thinking, even if we're not quite at the formal religion level. A religion's built up indeed cooperatively, and all of this is hacking, especially with the taboos and things, hacking life in a sense, right? If you can instill, even in a somewhat mindless sense, different taboos about fresh food, clean foods, and whatever, you preserve the life of the tribe longer, right? And that the burgeoning priestcraft and witchcraft from the elders, that the elders have survived, so they must know something about living that those who didn't survive missed out on. And so you can see there is almost a primitive life hack when it comes to religions. Although the approach is partial and prove it possible to utilize the notion of a belief system in respect of religion, given that various elements interconnect in complex ways, there is a certain freedom of action in cooperative elaboration on the ideas over time, flowing from the fact that the constraints in terms of the facticities are indeed relatively limited. Religion may be said to meet human needs, but in no sense is it a straightforward manifestation of them. People experience it as meaningful substantially as a result of accumulation, plainly, often from early childhood. Correlatively, it is often the case that those adults encountering a religion for the first time experience the whole, or at least some elements of it, as bizarre. For instance, the doctrine of the Trinity within Christianity, or the idea of original sin. Complexity derives also from the feature that it is simultaneously making several different types of contributions to the life of society. And I think we picked that up from also our Wells reading as well. The first issue to be addressed in its origin, as far as we can judge religion, originates naturally with the passage from the animal to the purely human level. But clarification, and all of this builds up stuff we talked about week one, right? The human being, not only physiologically has a body different than the other creatures. He walks upright. He has thumbs and big toes and mates facing the subject. And when that child comes to fruition, that gestation period, shall we say, of childhood is much longer than animals. So all of this differentiates man, but something else that differentiates man and plugs right into today. We covered all that stuff 2 weeks ago. But what plugs into right today is man knows he's going to die. He has a consciousness of not having been around, being around now, and at a certain point He knows from observation that he will die. Animals do not have that. And if they do, in the case of certain livestock, famously pigs and cows, they can sense, that the end is nigh, but it's in a much less, how should we say, uh, uh, phenomenological. That's not the word. What's the word? Existential. It's in a much less existential and much more immediate uh, framing and time, right? The cow doesn't sit around on the farm, or the pig doesn't sit around on the farm for months ahead of time, stressing over being butchered. However, in the feeding pen, that's when you apparently will see the animals beginning to panic, because they can somehow in a short term intuit that they are going to be killed, like the pigs in front of them are being killed. Strikingly, although early humans achieved full conceptualization of the physical world, it appears that the outlook at that stage could not possibly have been a kind of simplified version of a modern secularized or humanistic one. There are, however, important differences between explaining how a particular institution, like religion, may come into existence and explaining its persistence and relative stability once it does. So, too, it is not just the ubiquity of religion that needs explaining, but also its highly varied character, sources of variation, and that need to be identified. An initial objective is to throw light on a prime source of religious belief and activity. Various tendencies are apparent in the development of religion, and one main pattern here is initially tracked. There is the need to consider how humans conceptualize their situation, and then to show how this combines with and has implications for issues of power and legitimacy. The passage from the animal to the fully human level is marked by the capacity to use language, to the second half of our class momentarily, and also the theory of mind. These are critical in understanding human behavior. They enable individual human beings to grasp the intentionality of others, while people as a whole are able to fully comprehend that their existence is within a world of objects. On this basis, it can be understood how early humans come to conceptualize and understand and explain aspects of their situation and environment. Conceptualization would necessarily consist of two primary strands, which are clearly discernible in our thinking today. They arise because the significant environment of any one person consists, one, of the purposive, purposive, this is a day for fancy academic words or variations of words. The purpose-filled actions of people, let's say, and the non-purpose-filled environment. In this respect, the situation has remained unchanged since the emergence of Homo sapiens, utilizing language and theory of mind. Under one, the pattern of explanation and causation, while under two, it involves non-purpose-filled causation. Right? So language is going to greatly interact with this whole layout that we've been laying out, and Wells has been laying out with his take on religion, namely that religion is a hack. It has within it all of these taboos, even at the magic level of religion, which we're focusing on with the hunter-gatherers. It has baked into its dietary and sexual and tribal interaction taboos and enjoyments, ways to further the life of the tribe in a way that you don't have to think about it. It just becomes tradition. It just becomes, and then tradition that's invested with magical and supernatural powers, gives it an authority. As does the nascent priestcraft and priesthoods and so forth that we will be coming across as we look at very, very early history soon enough. History, of course, beginning with writing. But we get ahead of ourselves. Before we get to writing, of course, we need to speak. So when we come back, we're going to take a brief break just to stretch our legs. When we come back, we're going to get into what Wells brings our attention to at the end of this week's selection into next week, and that's the Indo-Europeans and historical linguistics. So just let me set things up here. For a few minutes, I'll duck out, we'll stretch our legs, and we'll be back for part 2 of this class. Okay, and we're back here. So, religion's origins and the Indo-Aryan theory. So, get the camera on, and okay. So, this is a helpful website. I've often found that these very primitive websites, this was actually made in 2019, if you look in the upper right here. So, that's quite interesting. It looks like it's from about 1999. But in any case, these simple websites often are treasure troves of information away from the razzle-dazzle of modern websites and AI and stuff. Anyway, in the late 18th century, a British judge living in India noticed, now we're talking about the Indo-Aryan theory of languages. He noticed profound similarities in several historical languages, which suggested to him that they shared a common origin. His hypothesis gave rise to the field of historical linguistics, the study of language change over time. Since then, 2 centuries of scholars, including the famous brothers Grimm of fairy tale fame, have worked out the general nature of that mother tongue and its culture, now referred to as Indo-European. We have shown that Indo-European civilization underlines much of Western civilization. Still, our knowledge of the original Indo-Europeans is far from complete. For instance, we don't know what their homeland was, that is, where they lived as a cultural entity, before spreading across most of the known world. All in all, the once mysterious Indo-Europeans and their descendants can now be seen as the most successful conquerors ever in human history. So here they give us some terms. We're not going to bog down too much. We can take a look there as I pour my hot water here. I had a very bizarre, short-lived sickness yesterday. Only lasted for a day. I must have been COVID-19, but I'm still on the mend. But my goodness, just one 24-hour period of great upset in my mind. In particular, I felt like a hangover times 3 for the whole day. It wasn't a hangover, but we had to have been some COVID thing. Anyway, I'm on the mends, hence the warm water. Okay, introduction. The archaeology of language. Let me just check the recording here. There we go. Everything's cool. Background music, good. Grand. Sufficiently calming, I trust. Okay. So, the discovery of the Indo-Europeans is one of the most fascinating stories in modern scholarship. The tale begins with linguists in the late 1700s, in particular William Jones, a British judge who lived in India, and in 1786 was the first person to suggest the possibility of Indo-European civilization. Jones's hypotheses opened a new door to the past and sparked modern science of historical linguistics. The Indo-European theory rests on the fact that various languages from all across Eurasia, in lands as far apart as India and Iceland, I'm looking for my outline of history. Stacks of books here, and I'm looking for that because in the actual written printed text, eventually these books that we're using in Apocatastasis, which you can download the PDFs for with the other additional readings, eventually they will be published as volumes, but that's way in the future because necessarily there's going to be a lot of changing out of different texts and so forth. But in the hard edition towards the Indo theory, there's a whole word chart, and he lists the different languages and the similarities of languages. Also, much like the Indo-Aryan theory, you also see the similarities of images. And I don't know if you can see this. This is the swastika, which we associate with the NSDAP in the 20th century, but is actually a symbol that's found, as our man here says, from India to Iceland. The swastika is all over the place. So not only do you have languages that have similarities, such as feminine words ending in the sound, as well as declensions, very similar declensions, as well as artifacts like the swastika. You have, for instance, pantheons consistently in Indo-European cultures, pantheons of 12 gods. You'll often see that. So, and the number 12 will come up again and again. Once Jones's successors began exploring the full linguistic record From this perspective, corroborating evidence started pouring in from all quarters. Parallels in vocabulary and grammar quickly emerged among foreign languages, particularly in what were then the oldest preserved tongues, Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit. The last is the language of the Vedas, an ancient body of writings from India, and close analysis of its text shows that Sanskrit has a strong affinity with Latin and Greek. For instance, the Sanskrit word for three, trayas, clearly cognate with the Latin tres and Greek tres, also words for three. Likewise, the Sanskrit sarpa, snake, obviously shares a common ancestor with the Latin serpens, the forebear of the English word serpent. Jones's simple and elegant remarks concluding the paper he wrote for the 1786 meeting of the Asiatic Society of Calcutta sums up this situation neatly. Quote, "No philosopher could examine all three languages, Sanskrit, Latin, and Greek, without believing them to have sprung from some common source which perhaps no longer exists." This priceless piece of understatement was the overture to many important and indeed revolutionary insights into the history of Western civilization. And here you can see on the right here, one of the proposed family trees of languages. I used to have a dictionary, and it had this in the inside cover. I think it was a dictionary, not this particular image, a much more beautiful, I thought, image. It had a tree, literally a tree, and the trunk was Indo-European. Then all the branches and sub-branches and leaves were all the delineations, much more complicated than this, but this is the same idea, where you have, the splitting off of the different language families. First and foremost was that there must have once been a mother tongue, which, as the peoples who spoke it spread across the globe, evolved into a family of daughter languages, of all of which, though they look different on the surface, for instance, the alphabets, are fundamentally related, since these languages can be found all over Europe and Asia. Scholars ultimately settled on the term Indo-European for this culture, and Proto-Indo-European as the designation for the mother tongue of all of them. Whilst it would be better to call the language by the name its original speakers gave it, that isn't possible, since no one has yet been able to figure out what that name was, or for that matter, what Indo-Europeans as a people called themselves. Despite that, however, scholars were able to deduce much else about them. Now, on this particular page, some of the images are not that crisp, so this is as blurry in recording as it is for me to see it on the screen, and this may just be the limits of the website or the coding on it. It almost looks like an image that someone right-clicked on to share the image in a new tab, and it distorted it. But it's not so distorted that we can't make out some similarities here. So across the bar on the blue there, we have some examples of English, Old German, Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, and Japanese. And so there's also another line that's delineating Japanese as, an example of a language that's completely outside of Indo-European compared to these ones that are similar. So just a few examples. In the 5 Indo-European examples given, one anis unus heis ekas, and then hitosu. 2, trois, duo, dava. 3, these are the letters, or the numbers, right? The numbers. 3, trachia, tres, trachias. Very, very close. 4, fidor, quatuor tetratres varas, and then for the previous numbers, I had not even attempted the Japanese. Let me see. Hitatsu for 1, futatsu, mitatsu, yotsu. So very different. That's the point. Very different. And there are obvious variations on the 5 examples given, but there are great similarities as well. That's the point. And where you see that also is father and mother. You see a lot of similarities across the different languages, say with a pater, vater, and so forth. For instance, our man says, as the study of linguistics advanced, it quickly became clear that quite a few languages belong to the Indo-European family. 3s again demonstrate the point well. Besides Latin tres, Greek trechis, and Sanskrit trechas, once again, there are the Spanish tres, the Danish, Italian, and Swedish tre, the French trois, the German dre, the Dutch drie, the Russian three, the English 3, and several other permutations, all based on Indo-European treyes. That these words are cognates is self-evident, especially when they're compared to 3 in non-Indo-European languages such as Turkish, Uk, Hebrew, Shalosh, Malay, Tiga, and the Chinese San. And in this case, Mitsu. And adding in other basic Indo-European words, there we go, like mother, mater, and father, pater, pater, make the case overwhelming. All these languages which exhibit so many cognates must once have had a common source. And this, of course, is speculation, which long precedes the good judge here, Judge Jones, not Judge Judy. Right? You have stories like in the Bible and the Quran about Babel. Is Babel in the Quran? I don't know, but the Bible certainly has this, the story of Babel. Well, you wouldn't have such a story, again, speaking in the natural plane, if you didn't have an interest in the diversity of languages. And even in the early modern period, or even the Renaissance before, you have all this speculation as to the Adamic language. As in that time, Europeans were coming across Indians, whom they were interpreting often as being almost like the original people, or the original, the closest to the original people, let's say. To Adam and Eve and how they would have lived. Often there were many, many speculations during the Renaissance and the early modern period about Indian, North American and South American Indian languages being the Adamic language. But the point is, whether it's the Babel ancient story or the early modern interest, or this Indo-Aryan theory, people have always had this idea of the common ancestor, and the common linguistic origins of men. It is a fascinating study, linguistics. The ramifications of the Indo-European theory were explosive, especially to Europeans of the 19th century. The presence of a long-lost common language presupposes, by definition, the historical existence of a common culture. Anthropologists have shown that unity of culture nearly always accompanies unity of language. And as the Indo-European spread both widely and successfully across the globe, that culture must have traveled with them. Given that, scholars began looking at the fundamental similarities in native Indo-European civilizations and found remarkable parallels. The implication being that, for all their seeming differences in religion, government, and family structure, peoples of Indo-European heritage share a cultural framework consistent with a shared origin. That is, the fundamental similarities in their cultures overshadow their superficial differences. It was a notion that was not well received in all circles, especially the Eurocentric, white supremacist factions which dominated the West in the 19th century. Now, we risk, stepping outside of our past focus to bring this up, but it is ticklish to me that the Indo-European or the Aryan theory of languages is often poo-pooed for the exact opposite reason. So in its day, the Indo-Aryan theory, we'll call it, was not received because it made people with, as I say, Eurocentric outlooks, rather uncomfortable to say that there was this much wider culture that was shared by what became European languages and culture and so forth, that this was actually just one kind of rump of a larger world that survived and developed in its own ways. What's interesting now in the 21st century is that when the Indo-European theory gets scorned and has almost been completely ignored in modern scholarship, or mainstream scholarship at least, it's for the opposite reason, because it allows Europeans and others to plug into it, and that wars against the type of deracination which is obtained since the Second World War. And there's a huge powder keg, of course, around a lot of scholarship, not about the war itself, but about, different groups that had theories of origins. So anyway, we brush up on some third rails there, and very happy to do so, but it's enough for this class, a class which I have to bounce from in order to join the prayers at the college in a few minutes. Maybe you'll join us sometime. You can go on our Divine Office tab and get the live link. But in any case, this particular theory, the Indo-Aryan language theory and cultural theory with the swastika and the gods and all this jazz, and the similarities and so forth, this indeed is very much a third rail, and has been, apparently since the 19th century for different reasons as time goes on. But time does go on, and I have to leave, and you have to leave and get on with your day. But thank you for hanging out. These are weekly broadcasts on the different sites of Apocatastasis. I hope you're not using YouTube. Lately, we've been kicked off some of our channels there. For my criticisms of Rumble and BitChute, they're at least more inclined to let you say whatever you want. And so go to Rumble and BitChute before you go to YouTube, because depending on the week, we may not be there on those channels, but it's more stability elsewhere. And of course, the best place is to go to Apocatastasis project site, where these classes will all be archived and easily accessible. Also accessible and downloadable for free is the text that you see me using, the word text on the screen there. So that way you can do the prep reading, or as you want, read for the coming week, before or after these classes. So anyway, there you go. And if you want to enroll on a more committed level, whether that's monthly, weekly, full-time, check out the project site, check out the whole Apocatastasis project, and I'll see you in class. Thank you so much, and Valete.